The Africa Union is championing 3 transformative institutions. The Africa Central Bank, which will issue a single currency and free our trade from dependence on foreign money. The Africa Monetary Fund, positioned to stabilize our economies and give us true financial sovereignty. And the Africa Investment Bank, designed to mobilize resources for infrastructure, industrialization, and integration that Africa needs to rise. And to complete this vision, the Africa Credit Rating Agency, one that understands our realities, values our uniqueness, and tells our story with fairness and truth, has already been established. Excellencies.
It's now being used as a weapon against a number of countries in the world. We must redouble our efforts to strengthen the link between trade and development.
You cannot claim to be the United Nations while disregarding the voice of 54 nations. It is not possible. Africa is no longer willing to wait on the margins of global governance while decisions about peace, security, and development are made without our understanding, without our perspectives, and without our voice. Africa's exclusion is not only unacceptable, unfair, and grossly unjust, it also undermines the very credibility of the United Nations, this organization. Africa dominates most of the Security Council agenda, provides some of the largest contingents of UN peacekeeping forces, and bears the heaviest costs of instability. Yet we remain the only continent without a permanent seat at the main table where decisions about our destiny are made.
As member states of the United Nations, we have all adopted the Sustainable Development Goals. However, many of these goals remain elusive. There are many reasons that hold many countries back from fulfilling and implementing these development goals. Some of these reasons are lack of sufficient financial resources that can finance the advance that these countries need to make to fulfill those goals. Many countries with developing economies, especially in Africa and the Global South, do not have adequate capital to finance their development goals.
When some people are waiting for rapture to happen, United Nations Summit was going on, and Africa was rising that time, because the speeches that South African President Ramaphosa and Kenyan William Ruto delivered, it made me happy. I'm not too much into African leaders, this with old mindset, but what they said, if they put it into the ground and work for it, it's a rising something in Africa, okay? Now, what happened in United Nations, I think it was in 2013, where they delivered their speech, shocked the very foundation of the global power. Africa stood up, not begging, not whispering, not apologizing, but standing tall with boldness and authority. President Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa and William Ruto of Kenya spoke with a fire that could not be ignored. And they make no mistake. Their words carried thunder. Their speeches did not just echo into the hall of New York, but they echoed across the world. And as they spoke, the white nations, the powers that once dictated Africa's destiny, fell into tremors of fear. That's what I thought, because Africa is no longer bowing down right now. Africa is rising. Let's watch these speeches and then we continue.
2 decades, Africa has spoken in one voice, demanding justice, equity, and representation in the highest organ of global governance. This demand, however, continues to be ignored, deferred, or endlessly debated to the detriment of both Africa and the legitimacy of the United Nations itself. You cannot claim to be the United Nations while disregarding the voice of 54 nations. It is not possible. Africa is no longer willing to wait on the margins of global governance while decisions about peace, security, and development are made without our understanding, without our perspectives, and without our voice. Africa's exclusion is not only unacceptable, unfair, and grossly unjust, it also undermines the very credibility of the United Nations, this organization. Africa dominates most of the Security Council agenda, provides some of the largest contingents of UN peacekeeping forces, and bears the heaviest costs of instability. Yet we remain the only continent without a permanent seat at the main table where decisions about our destiny are made. Africa deserves, ladies and gentlemen, at the very least, 2 permanent seats with full rights, including the right to veto, and 2 additional non-permanent seats on the United Nations Security Council. The world must understand that reforming the Security Council is not a favor to Africa or to anybody. It is a necessity for the United Nations' own survival. If the United Nations is to remain relevant in this century, it must reflect today's realities, not the post-war power arrangements of 1945. For instance, during the IMF's recent allocation of special drawing rights, 64% went to wealthy nations. Just imagine, 64%. With little need for liquidity support. They didn't need the money anyway, but they got 64%, while the poorer countries received just 2.4%. What a disconnect. The imbalance highlights how the very institutions meant to safeguard global finance stability often perpetuate inequality and instability. I have argued, and I say it again, that the current global financial architecture punishes poor countries with high interest rates and enormous conditionalities, while rewarding rich nations with lower interest rates and softer lending rates. Its rules, priorities, and allocation mechanisms consistently favor those already prosperous, while trapping vulnerable economies in cycles of debt, high borrowing costs, and inadequate access to emergency support and concessional funding. It is imperative to transform these institutions into genuinely independent, apolitical global bodies that their operations are aligned with their global mandate. Such a shift would democratize decision-making, restore credibility, and allow the IMF and the World Bank to serve all countries fairly rather than reinforcing old hierarchies. But Africa is not merely waiting for external prescriptions. We are taking bold and deliberate steps to strengthen our financial independence, safeguard our stability, and accelerate our development. Kenya, for instance, fully endorses the establishment of the Alliance of African Multilateral Financial Institutions, launched with the Africa Union in February 2024. This alliance brings together our homegrown banks, Afrexim Bank, the Africa Finance Corporation, the Trade and Development Bank, Shelter Afrique, Africa Re, Africa Development Bank, Africa Trade and Investment Development Insurance, and ZEPRI, institutions that embody Africa's determination to mobilize resources, finance trade, and build resilience on our own terms. At the same time, the Africa Union is championing 3 transformative institutions: the Africa Central Bank, which will issue a single currency and free our trade from dependence on foreign money; the Africa Monetary Fund, positioned to stabilize our economies and give us true financial sovereignty; and the Africa Investment Bank, designed to mobilize resources for infrastructure, industrialization, and integration that Africa needs to rise. And to complete this vision, the Africa Credit Rating Agency, one that understands our realities, values our uniqueness, and tells our story with fairness and truth, has already been established. Excellencies, as we mark the 80th anniversary of the United Nations, Africa also marks 20 years since the Ezulwini Consensus and the Sirte Declaration, the two historic milestones that establishes the common African position on UN Security Council reforms. For 2 decades, Africa has spoken in one voice, demanding justice, equity, and representation in the highest organ of global governance. This demand, however, continues to be ignored, deferred, or endlessly debated to the detriment of both Africa and the legitimacy of the United Nations itself. You cannot claim to be the United Nations while disregarding the voice of 54 nations. It is not possible.
80 years ago, the United Nations was established to save succeeding generations of humanity from the scourge of war and to build a peaceful, prosperous, and just world arising from the devastation brought about by global conflict. Through the UN Charter, the nations of the world pledge to uphold peace, development, and human rights, which would be underpinned by international law. Now more than ever, we are called upon to uphold the values and advance the purpose of the United Nations. We are also called upon to advance cooperation and solidarity between nations. We are called upon to promote multilateralism and safeguard the institutions that enable it. South Africa's engagement in the international sphere echoes our domestic imperatives of eradicating poverty, reducing unemployment, and addressing the root causes of inequality. Our foreign policy is guided not only by the needs of our people, but also those of the continent of Africa and the global South. Inspired by our own history, South Africa strives to maintain world peace and also the settlement of all international disputes through negotiation and dialogue and not through war. We therefore welcome the strong partnership between the African Union and the United Nations in promoting peace, security, and stability on the African continent. This year, South Africa is honored to preside over the G20. This is the first time that G20 Leaders Summit will be held on the African continent, the cradle of humanity. South Africa's G20 presidency is guided by the theme, equality, solidarity, and sustainability. To give full meaning to our theme of equality, solidarity, and sustainability, we have invited the G20 countries to join us in prioritizing the following areas. Firstly, in discussion to strengthen disaster resilience and response by addressing the increasing frequency and impact of climate-induced natural disasters. Secondly, to ensure that we have debt sustainability for low-income countries by crafting innovative ways to support countries to have low levels of debt to maintain economic stability. Thirdly, to discuss how to mobilize finance for a just energy transition by encouraging investments in renewable energy and sustainable technologies, without foregoing what we would call base load energy sources. Fourthly, by harnessing critical minerals for inclusive growth and sustainable development through the value addition processes, that is, beneficiation of these minerals at the source where the minerals are extracted, to foster the development of communities where these minerals are found. These priorities reflect South Africa's commitment to addressing global challenges and promoting inclusive growth and sustainable development. Our country's G20 presidency is a significant opportunity for South Africa to advocate for Africa's development agenda and to amplify African voices in global economic governance for a continent that is irreversibly on the rise. As member states of the United Nations, we have all adopted the Sustainable Development Goals. However, many of these goals remain elusive. There are many reasons that hold many countries back from fulfilling and implementing these development goals. Some of these reasons are lack of sufficient financial resources that can finance the advance that these countries need to make to fulfill those goals. Many countries with developing economies, especially in Africa and the global South, do not have adequate capital to finance their development goals. They are indebted and are paying much more on debt servicing than they do on health and education. In fact, these countries pay much more than countries in the North for their debt. Yet through global solidarity, by having fairer lending rules, especially for several of the global South countries, we can achieve our shared commitment. Through the G20 process, we are working towards building consensus on how this problem can be tackled, including the reform of international financial institutions, particularly multilateral development banks, to better tackle global challenges that many countries face. The multilateral trading system needs to be reformed as we reconfirm that the World Trade Organization remains the only multilateral body that is capable of managing differences and coordinating positions in global trade. Trade is one of the most important instruments to mobilize domestic resources for development. It is concerning that geopolitical shocks and unprecedented trade policy volatility are destabilizing the global economy and jeopardizing a critical source of development finance. In fact, trade is now being used as a weapon against a number of countries in the world. We must redouble our efforts to strengthen the link between trade and development. Unilateral trade practices and economic cohesion have a detrimental impact on many nations. This includes the economic embargo against Cuba, which has caused untold damage to the country's economy over the years. This unfair embargo must be lifted, and we want it lifted sooner rather than later.
Welcome. Now, on the stage of UN, the moment when these African leaders spoke, it matters a lot. And why does it matter? Okay? We have to understand why that moment is so much historical. To me personally, I thought it was, we have heard the speech, And for decades, the UN stage has been dominated by Western voices, dictating what peace looks like, what justice looks like, what development means, and who gets to lead. Okay, and African leaders were always sidelined, their voices ignored and their agendas dismissed. And even William Ruto said this, that it is high time. You are no longer going to make decisions about our future, to make decisions about our destiny, and we are not able to talk. We are not able to contribute. In this today, I tell you, we must get seats in this United Nations, seats that we can even be part of the decision making. So this summit was so much different. The world is changing. America is struggling with the internal divisions. Europe is fractured with the economic and political crisis. And the once untouchable Western order is weakening. And meanwhile, Africa, the continent they once called the dark continent, is shining with the new light. Okay? Its economy is growing. The youths are rising. The leaders are beginning now to speak with courage. That was courage I saw there. So when Ramaphosa and Ruto took the podium, it wasn't just about usual. It was about announcing to the world that we are not your subjects, are your equals. As soon as possible, or very soon, we are going to surpass you. It was boldly. Now, I will go direct to what Ramaphosa said. He talked about trader's weapon. You know, Ramaphosa looked the world in the eye and said something that white nations never wanted to hear. Trade is being used as a weapon. Think about that. For a number of years, Europe and America controlled the trade routes, controlled the markets, controlled the tariff, the sanctions. Okay? And they weaponized economies to punish nations, to destabilize governments and control resources. And right now, Ramaphosa has exposed this hypocrisy on the world stage. He didn't hide. He didn't sugarcoat. He declared that trade barriers and tariffs are destabilizing the global economy, okay, and crashing development. He wasn't just speaking for South Africa, but he was speaking for the global South, for every nation that has suffered under the iron fist of wealth economic control. White nations hate that kind of truth. It is reality, because their greatest weapon has never been the military. No. Their greatest weapon is economic dominance. And when Africa begins to question the challenge, or to challenge that dominance, their empire begins to crack. That is reality. Now, Ramaphosa again did not stop there. Demanded reforms of the United Nations itself. He spoke about the Security Council, okay? And this was the most powerful decision-making body in the UN. Spoke about how it's controlled by a few nations, mostly Western, okay? Who all decision when it suits their interest. They only make decision when it suits their interest. Africa has no permanent seat in the UN. Can you imagine that? Okay? The continent with over 1.4 billion people, rich in resources, rich in history, rich in potentials, and yet locked out of the highest level of global decision making. And Ramaphosa said that enough is enough. He called for the council to be reformed, to be more democratic, to include Africa as a permanent voice. And here's the truth. White nations fear this demand more than anything else, because if Africa gains the permanent seat, it will no longer be easy to bully the world. It will no longer be easy to impose wars. It will no longer be easy to impose sanctions or puppet government without challenge. Okay? And then came his most prophetic statement. He called for silencing all guns everywhere. He reminded the world that money should not be wasted on war, but invested in development, in education, in health, in building future. And this was not just a speech. This was a rebuke. A rebuke to America's endless wars, to Europe military interventions, to the global arms trade that keeps Africa bleeding while others profit. At that moment, the whole grew tense, because Ramaphosa wasn't just talking peace. He was exposing the very business model of the West. Okay? Now, Ruto, on the other hand, was bold. He talked about financial injustice. Okay? So if Ramaphosa struck the first blow, William Ruto followed with fire. He told the world that the international financial system is unjust. He spoke of how developing nations are crushed under debt while wealthy nations live off interest, luxury, and comfort. He declared that the rules of finance are outdated, designed to keep the rich richer and poor poorer. Okay? This is not just rhetoric. This is the heart of white supremacy on a global scale. Economic injustice. Africa sometimes is forced to borrow money with the high interest, to repay loans with the high interest, with impossible conditions, and give away the resources for cheap. And that's how they exploit Africa. Do you ever wonder how they exploit Africa. We complaining we are being exploited. It's because of these debts. The loans, high interest, and conditions of payment they just manipulate the markets and bails itself out whenever they want. And Ruto called this out directly. He demanded the fairer financial system, debt restructuring, and equality in global finance. In simple words, he told the West that your time of robbing Africa is ending. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine the fear in those rooms? Can you imagine the tension in the capitals of Europe and Washington's? For centuries, Africa was treated as a child needing guidance. But here was a Kenya president saying, no, we see through your games and we are coming to claim what is ours. Ruto too talked about UN reformed. Okay, William Ruto was not timid when he addressed the elephant in the room, the United Nations itself. He said that the UN is broken, outdated, and unjust. And he reminded the world that Africa, despite of size and contribution, does not have a single permanent seat in the UN. The countries in the UN are making vital decisions to our destiny. They are sitting and making decisions of our destiny, and we don't have any single representative. So Ruto declared that this imbalance can no longer stand. Africa must be recognized not just as a junior partner, not as a guest, but as a permanent decision maker in a global governance. And being honest, this is the nightmare of the white powers, because a strong African voice is the Security Council, means an end of one-sided wars in the Middle East, an end of the biased sanctions on African nations, and an end of hypocrisy on preaching democracy while practicing dictatorship at the global level. So Ruto's words carried the weight of history. He wasn't just asking to reform, but he was demanding justice. And white nations shifted uncomfortably because deep down, they knew that Africa is too big to ignore. Especially right now when shift is happening. You can't ignore right now Africa, okay? So this symbolism and Ramaphosa together, it symbolizes something. Just think about the power of that moment. Two African leaders, one from the south, one from the east, standing boldly and telling them on their face, Africa is no longer a child. Africa is no longer a junior when it comes to the global issues. For centuries, the colonizer thrived on dividing Africa, east against west, south against north. But when you talk about a united Africa demanding justice together, echoing the same messages in different voices, this is so big. The symbolism is terrifying the West, okay? Because unity of Africa is the greatest weapon to use right now. And unity of Africa is a nightmare to the West countries, to the European countries. And that's what they don't want. That's the one point they divided Africa like slice of breads. Let me be clear. Ramaphosa and Ruto did not carry guns to the UN. No. They carried words, but those words were sharper than any weapon. And they terrified the white nations for several reasons. First, because Africa is no longer begging. Two, because their words connected with the global south. And every leader from Latin America, from Asia and Caribbean who has suffered under Western domination had those words. But because Africa is not speaking from weakness anymore. This is not the Africa in the 1960s, okay? Just fresh from colonial rule. But this is the Africa, a continent that is fast growing in economies with the largest youth population. So we have that strength. We cannot be ignored. And fourth, because the West sees the empire collapsing, they know their population are shrinking, their economies are stagnating, their debts are exploding, and they know their old tricks of domination is no longer working easily right now. And this is why the speeches of these two African leaders terrified white nation, because for the first time in modern history, Africa is not reacting. Africa is leading. Africa has a new confidence, because what we are witnessing right now is a new era, African confidence. Ramaphosa and Ruto are just the faces of the broader movement across the continent. We have a lot of presidents that spoke, but I have picked these two from east and from south. What is happening right now? Young people are rising and pride with their identity. We are pride with the blackness. They told us that we are inferior, we are like this, but right now, young people are proud of themselves. We are rejecting the lies of inferiority and demanding the rightful place in the world. And look at the numbers. By 2050, Africa will have a population of nearly 2.5 billion people. You get me? Okay? And this is a force that will redefine global labor. This is a force that will redefine global markets, culture, and power. White nations look at these statistics and they shiver. They shiver because they know their aging population cannot compete with Africans' useful energy. And that's why they want a lot of Africans to go over there. Why? Okay. Economically, Africa is moving to, okay, from Kenya tech booming to Ghana to Nigeria creativity, Ethiopia manufacturing, South Africa down there renewable energy. Something is happening. Even politically, Africa is aligning. The African Union is pushing harder for continental integration, for free trade across borders, for shared infrastructure. Something is happening. Okay. So to fully appreciate this moment, we must contrast it with the history. Not too long ago, Africa was colonized. Its leaders humiliated, the people were enslaved, the resources were stolen. Okay, at the UN itself, African nations were once treated as juniors. Their leaders were even not speaking, just going, taking pictures. We are here, we have come here, landing, walking in the street of America or in the street of that country, and then we go home. This right now is what we call reversal of history. The colonized are now the challengers, the exploited are now the truth tellers, and silenced are now the loudest voice in the room. And this is why white nations are terrified, because deep down, they fear justice, they fear accountability, they fear a world where Africa is no longer bows its head, but it looks them in the eye and says, we are your equals, and soon we will lead. So let us not treat these speeches as ordinary politics. These are prophetic, okay? They symbolize the inevitable shift of global power. Africa is the future, and no amount of fear, no amount of propaganda, no amount of resistance can stop this. The Bible says the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. And for centuries, Africa was rejected, despised, dismissed. But right now, Africa is becoming the cornerstone of the new world, okay? Every major economic knows this. And that's why China is investing heavily in Africa. That's why America is suddenly turning back to Africa. That's why Europe is scrambling or new trade agreement. They all know the reality that without Africa, future cannot be written. So when Ramaphosa and Ruto spoke, they were not just addressing diplomats. They were speaking directly. They were declaring that the African century has begun, and that terrifies those who build their empire on Africa, on African suffering. So let me finish by saying this. Africa has entered a new era. We have entered an era of winning, era of rising, era of uniting, era of being superpower. And these voices just say something, because back then, voices like this could not be heard from African South or African side. But right now, we stand boldly on those platforms and we say it as it is. And we are telling them we are not going to trade together if this is not and this. That's what we need to hear from all of African leaders. Tell me what you think about the speeches. Until next episode, peace out.